subscribe to our channel and give us a like. We'll tell you what the textbooks leave out. This story will change everything you thought you knew about the Middle Ages. Picture this: southern France, the 12th century. Hills covered in vineyards, ancient villages dozing under the gentle sun. It seems like an idyll. But behind this calm, a storm is brewing. In the mountains of Languedoc lives a people whose beliefs differ so much from the Catholic Church that soon the entire region will be plunged into a bloody massacre. They're called by many names: Cathars, Albigensians, Heretics. But who were they really? Satanists who needed to be eradicated, or wise people whose ideas were centuries ahead of their time? To understand this, we'll have to dig deeper, beneath layers of legends, accusations, and church chronicles. The Cathars didn't just appear out of nowhere. Their worldview took shape over centuries, drawing from various sources: early Christian Gnostics, Manichaeans, and Bulgarian Bogomils. Their philosophy rejected the material world as evil, seeing the spiritual path as the only true way. They believed that the human soul was a prisoner in the body, and that the only path to salvation was to break free from the chains of the flesh. While the Catholic Church was building cathedrals, collecting taxes, and engaging in political intrigue, the Cathars preached poverty, simplicity, and a rejection of power and violence. Their spiritual leaders, known as the Perfects, led an ascetic lifestyle. They didn't eat meat, didn't marry, and owned no property. They were respected, and people came to them for advice. But it was precisely this, not the accusations of heresy, that made them dangerous. The Cathars were not just a religious movement, they were an alternative. In a society where the church and the nobility were closely intertwined, the Cathars offered a different path, a path of equality, conscience, and inner freedom. Their teachings spread quickly, from the poor to the lesser nobility. In Languedoc, entire towns supported them. The Catholic Church could not turn a blind eye to this. In 1179, the Third Lateran Council officially declared the Cathars heretics. But words were not enough. The Church saw that its influence in the region was rapidly weakening. Action had to be taken. And so began one of the darkest chapters in the history of medieval Europe, a crusade against Christians. In 1209, Pope Innocent III declared a crusade not to Palestine, but against his own people, against the inhabitants of Languedoc. Knights from northern France were called in to help. They were promised absolution of sins, glory, and land. For many, this was a profitable venture. The first city in the Crusaders' path was Béziers. There were indeed Cathars in the city, but also many Catholics. When one of the commanders asked the papal legate Arnaud Amalric how to distinguish heretics from faithful Christians, he supposedly replied, "Kill them all. God will know his own." On July 20th of the 12th century, Béziers was wiped off the face of the earth. About 20,000 people were killed. This was the beginning of the Albigensian Crusade, a prolonged, brutal conflict that lasted nearly 20 years, during which cities were burned, villages destroyed, and thousands of people, not only Cathars but also ordinary residents, died in fire and blood. But why did the Cathars provoke such fury? What was so dangerous about their teachings? To understand that, we need to look at the world they lived in. In the 13th century, the Catholic Church was not just a spiritual force. It was a state institution with its own armies, courts, and treasury. Faith was used as a tool of power. And then the Cathars appeared, rejecting the holiness of the Church, its sacraments, its hierarchy, and even the Pope himself. They taught that true faith is not about rituals or fear of hell, but about the inner work of the soul. The Cathars did not recognize baptism with water, only spiritual baptism called consolamentum. They rejected church marriages, refused the sacrament of the Eucharist, and did not accept the cross as a symbol of salvation. For them, Jesus was not God in the flesh, but a divine spirit who came into a world of evil to remind people of their true nature. This wasn't just a disagreement, it was a blow to the very core of medieval religion and its institutions. The church was losing its monopoly on the truth, and with it, its power. But despite the persecution, the Cathars held firm. They hid in the mountains, took refuge in castles, and held secret meetings. They were supported by local feudal lords, such as Raymond VI, Count of Toulouse. Some fortresses, like Montségur, became symbols of resistance. There, among the cliffs, the last Cathars held out against the armies of the Pope and the French king. All of Europe was watching this conflict. But behind the official rhetoric about fighting heresy, there were more down-to-earth goals: to subjugate independent Languedoc, establish royal authority, and seize land and wealth. Meanwhile, the Cathars continued their spiritual practices. Their perfects traveled from village to village, bringing knowledge and comfort. The dying were given the consolamentum, not for the forgiveness of sins, but as a reminder, you are not the body, you are the spirit, and death is only liberation. The winter of 1243. An army gathers at the foot of Montségur. French troops and Inquisition detachments surround the castle, the last stronghold of the Cathars. The besieged men, women, children, warriors, and the perfect understand there will be no miracle. This is the end. The siege lasts almost a year. There is little water and almost no food. Outside, catapults, ladders, constant pressure. Inside, prayers, philosophical conversations, and mutual support. But there was also fear, not for their bodies, but for not breaking, not betraying. The Cathars knew death was inevitable. But they did not beg for mercy, nor did they agree to repent. For them, surrender meant renouncing their path. And the path was everything. In the spring of 1244, Montségur fell. The besieged did not try to escape. More than 200 people refused absolution and were burned alive at the foot of the mountain. They went down in history as martyrs, although they themselves called it liberation. But there was one strange episode. A few days before the end, several Cathars managed to secretly leave Montségur. The chronicles mention that they took something important with them. Perhaps relics, perhaps documents, perhaps treasures. This gave rise to legends about the Cathar Grail, about hidden secrets that still haven't been found. After the fall of Montségur, the organized Cathar movement ceased to exist. But ideas don't die so easily. Their followers continued to live among ordinary people, secretly passing on their knowledge. In certain villages in southern France, up until the 17th century, you could still hear phrases reminiscent of Cathar teachings. Their ideas found their way into the poetry of the troubadours, into alchemical treatises, and into legends about the Holy Grail. The Inquisition continued its hunt. It wasn't limited to just the Cathars. Anyone who spoke differently, who thought, doubted, or asked uncomfortable questions could be accused. Torture, denunciations, and burnings at the stake became tools for purifying the faith. But true faith only became a shadow because of it. The Cathars, despite the persecution, left behind a philosophical legacy that still fascinates people today. Their views on life and death, on the soul and matter, on the power of inner freedom turned out to be much deeper than mere heresy. Even today, 800 years later, we still ask, who were the Cathars? On one hand, they really did reject the dogmas of the Church, but they did so not for the sake of conflict, but out of a desire for purity of faith. They did not wage wars, did not seek power, and did not impose their truth on others. Their heresy lay in the fact that they viewed the world not through fear, but through choice. The choice to be free in spirit, despite the chains of the body. Maybe that's exactly why they were so feared. The Church of that time could not allow an alternative center of power to emerge within Europe. The Cathars did not rob temples and did not preach violence. They were simply different. They showed that it was possible to live another way. Without intermediaries, without fear, without hierarchies. The idea of freedom always frightens those who are used to being in control. Today, it's not just historians who remember the Cathars. Their image inspires artists, writers, and filmmakers. They have become a symbol of the struggle for inner truth, for the right to think differently. In Languedoc, you can hear their name once again. Local residents honor the memory of those who perished. At the foot of Montségur, there is a monument to those who were burned for their beliefs. Inscribed on it are the words, "Let our memory burn, but not our truth." But questions remain. Why were the Cathars so certain of their path until the very end? What gave them such resilience? And what secrets did they take with them into the flames? To understand this, we need to go back to the beginning, to a world where things were not so clear-cut, where religion was not only about power, but also about the search for meaning, where the idea emerged that truth is not what is imposed on you, but what you experience yourself. In the second chapter, we will go back to the origins. How did the Cathar doctrine come about? Who were its first preachers? Why did it resonate specifically in Languedoc at the crossroads of cultures, languages, and routes? The answers lie where it all began. The story of the Cathars does not begin in Languedoc, not in France, and not even in Europe. Its roots go far to the east, to Persia, to Syria, to the Gnostic communities that were forming as early as the first centuries of our era. Gnosticism is not a sect, but a worldview. Gnostics believed that the world is divided. There is a spiritual reality, pure and perfect, and a material one which is fallen and evil. They considered matter to be a prison for the soul. Salvation, in their view, is possible only through gnosis, secret knowledge, the awakening of inner truth. This idea was at odds with official Christianity, which proclaimed that God created the world and that it is good. But the Gnostics said no. The world was not created by the highest God, but by a lower demiurge, and that's why it is full of suffering, death, and delusion. Later, in the 4th and 5th centuries, this philosophy merged with the ideas of Manichaeism, a religion founded by the prophet Mani, who tried to combine Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and Buddhism. The Manichaeans spoke of an eternal struggle between light and darkness, good and evil, where humans are the battlefield for these forces. The Church declared the Manichaeans heretics and persecuted them for centuries. But the ideas survived. They spread in secret, moving from country to country. In the 9th and 10th centuries, these views reappeared in the Balkans as the teachings of the Bogomils. The Bogomils were a Bulgarian religious movement that rejected the official church, wealth, power, and rituals. They preached modesty, asceticism, and equality. Their ideas quickly spread beyond Bulgaria, reaching Serbia, Bosnia, Croatia, and later Italy, France, and Germany. This is where the path to the Cathars begins. Languedoc is not just the south of France. In the Middle Ages, it was a unique world, a region where Romance and Occitan cultures met. There was less feudal violence here, more trade, and more cities. This is where troubadour poetry flourished. There was a relative religious tolerance here. Here, people were willing to listen. And when preachers came to Languedoc, bringing teachings about two principles, good and evil, spiritual purity, and the liberation of the soul, they were understood here. Originally, the Cathars did not call themselves Cathars. That name was given to them by their opponents. They themselves preferred the word, good people or good Christians. They did not seek to create a church. They simply wanted to restore purity to the faith. The Cathar doctrine was based on several principles. The world is the creation of an evil principle, the demiurge. The soul is a part of divine light imprisoned in the body. The goal of life is the liberation of the spirit through asceticism and knowledge. The church is not necessary. Everyone can find the truth on their own. Christ is not an incarnate God, but a messenger of light. The Cathars rejected all church sacraments, baptism, confession, masses. They did not recognize the cross as a symbol, considering it an instrument of execution. They did not eat meat, did not marry, and did not touch money. This was done by the so-called perfects. There were very few of them, no more than 1% of all followers of the doctrine. The rest, the ordinary believers, strove for perfection but lived regular lives. The central ritual among the Cathars was the consolamentum ceremony, a spiritual baptism performed by the laying on of hands. It symbolized purification, a final choice of path. Those who received the consolamentum were no longer allowed to lead a worldly life. It was a vow that lasted until death. Interestingly, the Cathars were not characterized by fanaticism or aggression. They did not impose their faith on others. Moreover, if someone was not ready to follow the path of the perfect, they were not condemned. The main thing was, it was a personal choice, and perhaps that was the main threat to the Catholic Church. In Languedoc, the Cathars spread not by force, but by persuasion. People saw that these preachers lived in poverty, spoke clearly, took no money, and did not seek power. Against the backdrop of church hierarchs surrounded by luxury, this looked like a real revolution. Cathari teachers went around the villages, taught, helped, consoled, they were respected, they were invited into homes. Some nobles openly accepted the Cathar teachings. Thus, a parallel spiritual reality emerged in the region, one that had no need for the Pope, bishops, or cathedrals. All of this could not go unnoticed. At first, the Church tried to argue with them. Papal legates came to Languedoc and organized debates. But the Cathars were well prepared. They quoted the Gospel, reasoned logically, and did not insult anyone. People listened and chose them. When words stopped working, pressure began, excommunication, political pressure, threats, and eventually a crusade. But more on that in the second part of the chapter. There we'll find out how at first they tried to persuade the Cathars and then wipe them off the face of the earth. Why was philosophy stronger than an army? And how did simple preachers manage to shake the very foundations of the empire of faith? The Cathars did not openly challenge anyone. They did not take up arms against kings or call for rebellion. But at their core, they posed a much greater threat than any rebels because their strength lay in persuasion. In response to the growing popularity of the Cathars, the Catholic Church tried to take control of the situation. At the beginning of the 13th century, it organized public debates between Cathar preachers and official theologians. One of the most famous was the debate in Montreal in the 12th century. On the Cathar side, the outstanding preacher Esclarmonde de Beville took part, while on the Catholic side it was the future Saint Dominic. The goal of these debates was not to convince the Cathars. They were difficult to persuade. The goal was different, to convince the crowd. But the reality turned out to be unpleasant for the Church. The Cathars responded calmly, referred clearly to Scripture, and behaved modestly. The Catholic legates often appeared irritated and arrogant. The people who came to listen increasingly sided with the good Christians. The Cathar idea especially took root among the petty nobility and urban artisans. This was a class that was tired of feudal extortion, war, and double standards. The Cathars offered an alternative, not a utopia, but a path to personal honesty and inner peace. In some regions, the Cathars became so influential that they displaced the Catholic clergy. There were cases when a village would refuse to let in a bishop and would only accept a Cathar perfect. This was no longer just a religious dispute. It was an outright weakening of the Church's authority. Pope Innocent III, a shrewd strategist and tough politician, understood that words alone wouldn't help. Forceful intervention was needed. In 1208, he sent a new legate, Pierre de Castelnau. He firmly demanded obedience from the local lords, including Raymond VI, Count of Toulouse, a powerful patron of the Cathars. Soon after, Pierre de Castelnau was killed. Suspicion fell on the Count's men. That was enough. In 1209, the Pope declared a crusade against the Cathars. It was the first in history aimed not at Muslims, but at Christians. From that moment, the religious conflict turned into a military campaign. Thousands of knights from northern France flocked to Languedoc. They were motivated by promises of forgiveness for their sins and the prospect of new lands. For many, it was a profitable venture under the guise of a holy war. Thus, religion once again became a tool of politics. The first victim was the city of Béziers. Both Cathars and Catholics lived there. When the besiegers asked whom exactly they should kill, the papal legate gave the now infamous phrase, "Kill them all. God will know his own." On July 20th of the 12th century, the city was destroyed. According to various estimates, between 10 and 20,000 people were killed. No distinctions were made. No trial, no chance. This was the signal. There would be no more compromises. The Albigensian Crusade lasted almost 20 years. The Cathars hid in the mountains, moved from village to village, lost followers, but kept holding on. The Perfects played an especially important role. They were considered pillars of faith, examples for others. When they died, especially at the stake, it was seen not as a defeat, but as heroism. The Church realized that to defeat the Cathars, it wasn't enough to burn their homes. They needed to destroy the very structure itself. That's how the Inquisition came about. The Inquisition wasn't just a court. It was a system built on fear, informants, and psychological pressure. Testimonies were accepted even without eyewitnesses. The accused might not even know what exactly they were being suspected of. The only way to avoid torture was to confess, even if you were completely innocent. The Cathars became victims more and more often, but it wasn't just them. Anyone who spoke about the Church's poverty, who read the scriptures in their native language, or who expressed doubt fell under suspicion. An atmosphere of fear swept over Languedoc, and yet traces of the Cathars could still be found up until the end of the 14th century. Somewhere in the mountains, hermits were hiding. Somewhere, the texts of their teachings were being copied into books. Somewhere, people were still whispering to their children, "Be honest, be humble. Don't trust those who seek power in the name of God." And here's the question. If this was heresy, why did its traces last for so long? The answer, perhaps, is that the Cathars spoke not so much about religion as about conscience. Their message was simple. Don't live a lie. Don't mistake evil for good. Don't obey just because you're told to. Ideas that cannot be burned at the stake. They said, the body is temporary. Power is an illusion, money is dust. But the choice is always yours. In many ways, the Cathar teachings were anti-establishment not only for the Middle Ages, but for any era. That's exactly why it was so frightening, and that's exactly why it endured. In the next chapter, we'll journey into the heart of the Cathar fortresses in Poitiers, Carcassonne, Minerve, and of course, Montségur. We'll see what their final battle looked like, and we'll understand. Even under the sword's onslaught, they stayed true to themselves. These walls remember vows, prayers, and screams. Forbidden words were whispered under the stone arches, and sacred texts were hidden in the dungeons. Welcome to the heart of the resistance. This is where the Cathars made their last stand. Subscribe to our channel so you don't get lost in history. It's been almost 10 years since the start of the Albigensian Crusade. The major cities have fallen, the churches have regained control, and many Cathar followers have been executed, but not all of them. In the Pyrenees Mountains, among cliffs and gorges, stood fortresses, impenetrable, stubborn, as if they had grown out of the rock itself. These were not just military fortifications. They were temples of faith, sanctuaries of the spirit, where the Cathars not only hid, but continued to live by their own laws. One of the first such fortresses was Carcassonne, a fortress city with powerful walls, protected on 3 sides by water. At the beginning of the 13th century, Carcassonne became a refuge for many Cathars who had been driven out of other cities. Here they were protected by Raymond Roger Trencavel, a young viscount who, although he was a Catholic, refused to obey orders from the north. In 1209, the Crusaders approached Carcassonne. The city was besieged. There was a shortage of food and water, and disease began to spread. Trencavel decided to enter into negotiations, but instead of peace, he was seized, thrown into a dungeon, and soon died under mysterious circumstances. Carcassonne fell. The local Cathars were forced to flee. Many of them hid in Minerve. Minerve is a picturesque town perched atop a hill, surrounded by cliffs. In 1210, the army of Simon de Montfort, the leader of the Crusaders, arrived there. Minerve surrendered. 140 Cathars who refused to renounce their faith were burned alive. It was an act of intimidation, deliberate and cold-blooded. But fear did not take hold. People didn't turn away from the Cathars. On the contrary, they began to see them as martyrs. Stories about those who were burned spread, inspiring new followers. And so, the Cathars made their way to the most inaccessible place, the mountain fortress of Montségur. It stood atop a cliff at 1,200 meters, like a watchful nest above the valley. This place became the symbol of the entire Cathar movement. Montségur didn't just shelter refugees. It became their spiritual center. Secret gatherings were held there, preachers flocked to it, and texts, and possibly relics, were kept there. Some sources claim that the legendary Grail, a symbol of spiritual purity, was kept at Montségur. What it actually was, a physical object, a book, or knowledge, remains a mystery to this day. In 1243, the French army began the siege of Montségur. Nearly a year of resistance. Cold, hunger, disease. But the Cathars did not surrender. There were about 200 people, among them women, children, the elderly, and about 20 perfects. Catholic chronicles describe the resilience of the besieged with amazement. Not a single mutiny, not a single attempt at betrayal. Even in the face of death, they did not beg for mercy. In March 1244, the fortress fell. The Crusaders allowed everyone to come down and choose: renounce the Cathar faith or be burned. More than 200 people chose the latter. At dawn, they were all led to the foot of the mountain. There was no noise, no shouting, no curses, only singing. According to legend, the Cathars walked to the pyre singing. That was their way of conquering fear. They were burned, but destroying an idea is not so easy. After Montségur, the Cathars disappear from the chronicles. The survivors go underground to rural homes, to forests, to caves. Some set out for Italy and Catalonia. In these places, their ideas would continue to live on. But even the fall of the fortresses was not the end. It was only proof. Faith, founded not on fear but on choice, can withstand both fire and sword. In the second part of the chapter, we will follow in the footsteps of those who escaped. We'll find out what secrets they might have carried out of Montségur, and why the legend of the Cathar treasure still keeps historians restless to this day. If you're curious to learn what was hidden within the walls of Montségur, give us a like and subscribe. We're moving on, right into the heart of the mystery. Montségur fell but a few days before the final assault, according to chronicles, for Cathars descended the sheer cliff on the northern side. They knew the local trails and were experienced in the mountains. No one noticed them. What did they take with them? Some believe it was gold, others say it was sacred books. Others are convinced it was knowledge, maybe something so important that it couldn't be left to the enemy. Since then, dozens of theories have appeared and disappeared across Europe, from the Cathar treasure to the Holy Grail. But the main thing is that it became a myth. And a myth isn't just a fabrication, it's memory that has become a symbol. There's a theory that the Cathars hid a secret archive, ancient books, manuscripts, philosophical treatises. It's possible that some of those texts came from the Bogomils or even the Manichaeans. Some of these manuscripts resurfaced later in Italy, where the Cathar movement experienced a second revival. In the Piedmont region during the 13th and 14th centuries, communities appeared that were strikingly similar to the Cathars. The same ideas, the same structure, the same simplicity. They were called Paterini or Dialcinites, named after the preacher Fra Dialcino. Like the Cathars, he rejected the church, lived in the mountains, had followers, and in the end, Paspagib Viagni. What if the Cathars really did pass on their truth to others? Historians argue. Some believe that Catharism was completely destroyed, while others think it became part of Europe's spiritual underground. But there is one important observation. After the Cathars, the ideas of dualism, equality, and spiritual freedom never completely disappeared. They came back in the Waldensian movement, in the Protestant Reformation, in the anarchist circles of the 19th century. Because once an idea is born, it keeps on living, even if people try to burn it. Let's return to Montségur. When the bodies of the Cathars burned at the stake, only bare earth remained. But for centuries, the locals avoided this place, out of respect or fear. It was only in the 20th century that a memorial was erected here. On the stone, there is a simple inscription, "In memory of the 200 Cathars burned here for their faith. May truth prevail." Every year, people climb up there. Tourists, historians, seekers of truth. Some are searching for evidence, others for inspiration, but everyone feels the same thing. This place holds a power, not physical but spiritual. Even today, Montségur hosts reenactments, lectures, and commemorative processions. People recite poetry, sing in Occitan, and remember those who chose death rather than betray their beliefs. This isn't a cult, it's an attempt to reclaim what history tried to forget. Within these walls, questions still echo. Why weren't they broken? What drove them? And is it true that faith isn't about fear, but about choice? The Cathars proved that it's possible to live differently, without power, without greed, without fear of hell. Their path was difficult, but honest. And maybe that's exactly why it's still so frightening today. They were burned, but not defeated. They were exiled, but not silenced. They were forgotten, but remembered again. Their story isn't just a tragedy, it's an example. An example of how inner conviction can be stronger than external force, of how ordinary people without armies challenged the most powerful organization of their time and left a mark that centuries could not erase. In the second half of the film, we'll go further. We'll look at how the church justified its violence, how the Inquisition rewrote the truth, and how modern researchers are restoring the real story of the Cathars, drawing from the ashes a vivid, living picture that challenges any dogma. The world is often afraid of those who think differently. But what happens when fear becomes law? Subscribe to our channel and you'll find out what the machine built to destroy dissent looked like. Today, we'll peer into the very heart of darkness, the halls of the Inquisition. When the last pyre in Montségur was extinguished, the papal authorities realized that the sword alone was not enough to defeat heresy. The Cathars weren't fighting for land, they were fighting for an idea. And you can't storm an idea, you have to destroy it from within. That's how the Inquisition came to be, a special mechanism designed not just to find heretics, but to root out doubt itself. Its purpose wasn't to defend the faith, but to control minds. This was a court where the accused had no right to a defender, nor even to know the nature of the charges against them. His only option is to confess. And if they didn't confess, they would be broken. The first inquisitors appeared in southern France in the 1210s. The church carefully selected its personnel, educated, fanatically devout, and free of doubt. Among them were Dominicans, monks whose reputation was built on fighting heresy. It was they who became the enforcers of official doctrine and the creators of a system of terror. The procedure was simple and terrifying. The inquisitor would arrive in the village. He would call a meeting and announce, "You have a deadline, usually 30 days, to voluntarily turn in all heretics, confess, and report your neighbors." Cooperation promised leniency. Silence brought suspicion, and doubt meant torture. Testimonies were taken anonymously. 2 witnesses were enough if they had bad reputations. There was no need for physical evidence. Words, that was the main weapon of the Inquisition. Interrogations took place in monastery basements or in special houses called houses of faith. Various forms of pressure were used, from isolation and starvation to sophisticated torture. Popular methods included hanging people by their hands tied behind their backs, water torture, pouring water into the nose and mouth until the victim nearly suffocated, and stretching the body on a special rack. Officially, the church claimed that torture was used only to confirm suspicions, but in practice, it was a machine for extracting confessions. One chronicler wrote, "The Inquisitor prefers a body that is bent and broken. It's easier to reach the soul that way." But even that wasn't enough. In the 13th century, the Inquisition developed lists of suspicious signs. If a person wore simple clothes, avoided meat, didn't go to church, read a lot, or gathered in solitude, all of this could indicate heresy. Special attention was paid to women. Many of the perfect Cathars were women. They preached, taught, and accompanied the dying. For the church, where women had no voice, this was unbearable. A woman with convictions was seen as a threat. In the records of the Inquisition, there are hundreds of women's names, peasants, widows, even girls of 14 or 15 years old. They were interrogated, broken, and burned simply for listening to the wrong people. The church said, "We are defending the truth," but whom was it protecting and from what? The Inquisition's court records have survived. They are grim and frighteningly detailed. They contain protocols, interrogations, confessions, names. Everything is documented. But between the lines, what you read is not faith, but fear. Not justice, but intimidation, cruelty, and control. For example, in 1246, in the village of Montségur, 63 people were arrested. Some of them were accused simply because they once gave shelter to a stranger who might have been a Cathar, others because they failed to report it. Even children were interrogated. Torture didn't stop even after confessions, because the point wasn't the truth, but the destruction of the individual. If a person refused to recant, they were burned. If they did recant, they were forced to name others. The only way to survive was to become a tool of the system. The Inquisition didn't just burn bodies, it erased memories. Cathar books, texts, even frescoes were destroyed. Any thought that went beyond the accepted boundaries was declared a lie. And those who preserved the memory became the next targets. But there was another side to it. The pressure from the Inquisition sparked a wave of sympathy for the Cathars. People began to realize that it wasn't monsters being destroyed, but neighbors, friends, and family. Fear turned into doubt, and doubt into the question, is everything they tell us from above really true? In the second part of the chapter, we'll find out how the Inquisition became a global mechanism for suppressing free will across Europe, and how it was no longer priests, but neighbors who started watching for heresy, and how this legacy has continued to shape our perception of religion and freedom to this day. By the 13th century, the Inquisition had become a full-fledged organization with branches all across Europe. It was no longer limited to Languedoc. Now, suspicion of heresy could fall on any Christian from the Pyrenees to the Danube. A network of informants, secret courts, and fear, all of this became the new normal. The Inquisition was especially active in Spain, where later, in the 15th century, it would become a separate, even more brutal institution, the Spanish Inquisition. But the seeds of fear were sown precisely in the era of the Cathars. Along with the fight against the Cathars, the battle against doubt itself began. The Inquisitors didn't just hunt heretics, they shaped the way people thought. People were taught to fear questions, to be wary of their own thoughts, and not to say out loud anything that could be interpreted as heresy. This applied to everything. You couldn't argue about the nature of God. You couldn't criticize the wealth of the clergy. You couldn't read books without permission. You couldn't pray differently. Even customs became suspicious. If a family ate modestly, didn't drink wine, avoided meat, and prayed at home, It could be seen as secret Catharism. An atmosphere was created where anyone could become an informant. Neighbor against neighbor, student against teacher, children against parents. This mechanism undermined trust in society and allowed the church to control not only behavior, but also people's minds. It was at this time that what would later be called religious censorship emerged, not as a choice, but as the imposition of the only acceptable viewpoint. Everything else was punished. That's how the Cathar books disappeared, along with the works of the Gnostics, texts that could have told an alternative version of events. But it's impossible to erase everything. In remote regions of France, especially in the villages of Languedoc, the memory of the Cathars lived on in oral stories, proverbs, and riddles. People remembered them not as heretics, but as kind, quiet, and just. This was passed down from generation to generation. Some 19th century researchers, traveling through these areas, recorded how the elders would tell stories about how our ancestors burned, but did not scream. Amazingly, it was these very folk legends that sparked the renewed interest in the Cathars. The Inquisition, despite its cruelty, failed to achieve its main goal. It did not destroy the idea. The Cathars, their ideas, their memory, survived the flames. Their philosophy echoed into the future during the Reformation, in the Age of Enlightenment, in the works of Tolstoy, in the novels of Umberto Eco, in films, in music, and, most importantly, in the questions people continue to ask themselves. Is it really necessary to obey if you disagree? Is the truth always on the side of the majority? And where is the line between faith and violence? The Inquisition remains a terrifying symbol, a testament to what fear of free thought can lead to. Today, it is studied, condemned, and displayed in museums. But the main thing is to make sure it never happens again. Because the machinery of repression isn't just about the pyres. It's the fear to speak, the fear to think, the fear to be different. The Cathars were the first to face this on a national scale. People tried to break them, erase them, and make them forgotten. But 8 centuries have passed, and we're talking about them again. In the next chapter, we'll take a deeper look at their teachings, not from the perspective of accusations, but from the viewpoint of a modern person. What did the Cathars say about good and evil? Why did they reject authority? And can their philosophy really be called a religion? Or was it a form of ancient humanism? What did the people who chose death rather than betraying themselves believe in? They weren't interested in stone temples. What mattered to them was the temple within. Subscribe and we'll explore the Cathar teachings not as heresy, but as an attempt to find light in the darkness. When Cathar preachers came to a home, they didn't demand baptism, didn't call people to church, and didn't judge anyone. They would sit next to you, look you in the eyes, and say, "You are not your body, you are light imprisoned in flesh." It was with this simple, almost Buddhist idea that the teaching began, one the church called deadly dangerous. The Cathars were guided by the idea of dualism. The world is ruled by 2 forces, light and darkness. Light is spirit, truth, and love. Darkness is matter, lies, and suffering. According to their faith, a person is a divine spark trapped in a bodily prison. That's why everything connected to the body, from food to sexuality, from power to war, was considered a consequence of the fall. But unlike fanatics, the Cathars did not demand that everyone completely renounce the world. Their society was divided into perfect spiritual teachers who lived in strict asceticism, and believers, those who lived ordinary lives but aspired to the truth. The perfect ones renounced everything: marriage, meat, possessions, even oaths. Their ideal was purity, and they carried it as an inner light. They did not preach from pulpits, did not build churches, and did not accept offerings. They were respected for their way of life, not for their power. The ritual of spiritual baptism was central to their practice, but it was received only after a long period of preparation, sometimes right before death. It was not a formal act, but a deep inner decision. I renounce the lies of the world. I walk toward the light. The Cathars did not recognize water baptism, did not venerate the cross, did not participate in the Mass, and did not acknowledge church hierarchy. They believed that Christ did not suffer physically. He was a spirit who came not to save the body, but to awaken consciousness. For them, salvation was not something external. It happened within a person as awareness, as enlightenment. They taught that hell is not a place, but the repetition of rebirth. A soul that has not been freed returns to this world again and again until it finds the path to the light. This idea resonates with Eastern beliefs, and many researchers suggest that the Cathars may have inherited not only from the Gnostics and Manichaeans, but also from Eastern mystical schools. An important aspect of Cathar philosophy was the rejection of violence. The perfects could not kill even in self-defense. They could not lie, swear oaths, or judge others. This made them vulnerable, but this was exactly where their strength lay. Even their enemies respected them. For their consistency, for the fact that they never betrayed their principles even under torture. Their concept of God was also different from the Catholic one. They spoke not of an almighty judge, but of an unattainable light, the source of goodness. All material things were considered the creation of a lower principle, the demiurge, the very one who tempted the world with illusions. That's why they rejected icons, altars, and church decorations. All of that was considered a lie, a performance. For the Cathars, faith was about behavior, not something immaterial. It was a ritual of reason and fear. That's exactly why they rejected the idea of sacred authority. Neither the Pope, nor the bishop, nor the king could rule over a human soul. In other words, each person was their own church. Every choice was an act of faith, and that was truly revolutionary. Because unlike those who fought for power, the Cathars fought for freedom from it. They weren't interested in thrones, positions, or money. They cared about only one thing, to emerge from the darkness and carry the light forward. Their philosophy wasn't built on fear of punishment, like the Catholic churches, but on personal responsibility. You are responsible for your own actions, and no one can repent or atone on your behalf. In the second part of the chapter, we'll explore how this philosophy influenced the world, from the Reformation to humanism, from Eastern wisdom to modern spiritual quests. And most importantly, we'll find out why, 800 years later, this idea is becoming relevant again. The Cathars disappeared from the maps of Europe. Their books were burned, their names erased, their pyres long since cooled. But the spirit of their philosophy did not. It continued to live on, changing form, inspiring those who also refused to live in a world of dogma and fear. In the 16th century, the Reformation began. Martin Luther, John Calvin, Thomas Montségur, all of them raised questions about what true faith really is. Rejecting the papacy, striving for personal interpretation of the Bible, criticizing the wealth of the church. All of this was, in essence, a continuation of the ideas for which the Cathars were burned. Luther himself never mentioned the Cathars, but the spirit of rebellion against the monopoly on truth, the drive for inner honesty, that was the same movement of the soul. People once again began to ask themselves, what if God isn't in the church, but within me? What if faith isn't about fear of hell, but about searching for meaning? In the 18th century, the Enlightenment arrives. Reason, freedom, humanism. The thinkers of Europe begin to re-examine the past. Philosophers become interested in the Gnostics, the Manichaeans, and the Cathars. Their teachings are now studied not as heresy, but as an alternative, as the voice of a minority that was not silenced, but merely drowned out. The Cathars, in particular, attract the interest of poets and artists of the 19th century. French romantics see them not just as victims, but as heroes of the spirit. Some write ballads about the last ascent to Montségur. Others write novels about the secret books of the Cathars. Their myth is now being revived in culture. But the most interesting part begins in the 20th century. After the horrors of 2 world wars, after the camps, executions, and mass ideologies, people once again return to the question, where can we find support? Who can be an authority if even religions and the state lead to destruction? The answer comes in an unexpected form, in an interest in personal spirituality, not in institutions, but in inner practices. People read the Gnostics, study Eastern teachings, and practice meditation. And against this backdrop, the teachings of the Cathars seem surprisingly relevant. They said, "Do not fear death, fear a meaningless life. Do not seek the truth outside, find it within. Do not serve power, serve the light." Modern researchers find parallels between Cathar philosophy and Buddhism, Stoicism, and Taoism. Renunciation of passions, the search for harmony, and the understanding of the world's illusory nature are themes that have once again become important in the 21st century. And what about moral guidelines? The Cathars were strict, but not cruel. They did not judge people for their mistakes. They believed in the gradual awakening of the soul. Their perfect ones did not accuse, but inspired. The ideal was not a perfect person, but a person who moves toward the light, despite fear, despite weaknesses. That is exactly why they were respected. Today, in a world where voices are increasingly saying, "You must be perfect, you have no right to doubt," Cathar gentleness becomes a breath of fresh air. Their philosophy said, "You don't have to be a saint, but you can become better. Don't judge, don't rule, just keep going." They were not utopians. They knew the path was difficult, and that's why they shared their journey. Some strive for self-improvement, others offer support. It wasn't a sect, but a community where everyone could be themselves, yet never stopped seeking the truth. Finally, we come to the main question, were the Cathars heretics? From the perspective of 13th century Catholic doctrine, absolutely. They rejected the foundations of church teaching. From a historical perspective, they were the first to offer an alternative to the authority of faith. In essence, they were spiritual dissenters. And as for the moral point of view, the Cathars did not kill, did not rob, did not rule. They lived modestly, spoke quietly, and died with dignity. If this is heresy, then maybe these are exactly the kind of heretics we need. In the next and final chapter, we'll bring everything together. We'll see how the story of the Cathars affects us today. Why does it stir up such strong emotions? And most importantly, why does it keep coming back, despite all attempts to forget it? 8 centuries have passed, but if you close your eyes, you can hear the mountain wind whisper, "We were, we are." The Cathars vanished in the flames, but their story still lingers in the air. Subscribe and we'll finish this journey together. Among the tourists climbing up to Montségur, few can imagine what happened here. They take photos, marvel at the view, and look for shade. But sometimes, right next to the ruins, someone leaves flowers. No inscriptions, no words, just flowers. Memory lives on in strange ways. It's not always loud. Sometimes it's silent. That's how it is with the memory of the Cathars. They aren't honored in textbooks. They don't have holidays, but in southern France, they are still remembered. in songs, in symbols, in local museums, and more often in the eyes of those who seek the truth. In the 20th century, interest in the Cathars began to grow. They are mentioned in books on the history of religion, in esoteric treatises, in novels, films, and even in games. They become a symbol of resistance. Not with weapons, but with light. They are often compared to the Templars, the Freemasons, the alchemists, and not by accident, although in reality they were simpler. Their strength was in their honesty. The Cathars didn't build empires. They didn't persecute other believers. They didn't want to rewrite the world. They simply followed their own path. And that alone was enough for an army to be sent against them. Paradox? Not at all. History shows people fear most those who are unafraid, who can't be bought, who can't be sold, who refuse to accept lies, even in the name of peace. That's why, in the 21st century, the story of the Cathars is more relevant than ever. We live in a world where ideologies change like clothes, where the truth grows ever quieter while the noise gets louder and louder, where faith turns into marketing, and freedom becomes the illusion of choosing between two identical options. And against this backdrop, here they are, the Cathars, ordinary people who said, "We will not fight, we will not submit, we will live according to our beliefs. And if we must, we will die without betraying ourselves." This isn't fanaticism, it's resilience. A deep human resilience without pretense or grandstanding. Perhaps that's exactly why, in recent decades, there have been initiatives to restore historical justice. In some French cities, there are Cathar Remembrance Days, and schools have introduced elective courses on the history of heresies. Not as accusations, but as an exploration of alternatives. And what about the myths? The Grail, treasures, secret books. All of that is beautiful, intriguing, but secondary. The true treasure of the Cathars is not an object, but an example. It's the image of how you can be different and not be afraid, how you can be in the minority and stay true to yourself, how you can lose a battle but win in eternity. It's symbolic that in the 21st century, the Cathars are once again seen as dangerous, not to the church this time, but to the consumerist logic of the world. They can't be sold, monetized, or turned into a brand. They remind us, you are not your body, you are not your status, you are not likes and followers, you are light. And if you remember this, it means their flame has not gone out. In the second part of the chapter, we'll finish this journey. Let's sum it up. What exactly did the Cathars do? Why does their teaching still inspire people? And what can each of us do to make sure their path doesn't fade away in the noise of the centuries? What did the Cathars leave us? No books, almost all were destroyed. No artifacts, they weren't kept in golden caskets. No buildings, they didn't build temples. They left us an example that you can be a believer and still be free, that you can reject violence and still be strong, that you don't have to fear even death if you live in truth. The Cathars showed that faith isn't about what you repeat, but about how you live. It's not about ritual, but about action, not about words, but about choices. And they made that choice every day right up to the very end. We don't know the names of those who burned at the foot of Montségur. History hasn't preserved their biographies, but we know their spirit. They didn't become martyrs because they wanted glory. They simply couldn't do otherwise. And in that lies their immortality. The Cathars taught, don't take anything on faith that hasn't been tested by your own heart. Don't obey if the price is your soul. Don't blame others. Start with yourself. Don't build walls between yourself and the light. This wasn't a religion, but a way of life. Quiet, consistent, and full of inner discipline. Today, when there is so much noise around us, their silence sounds especially loud. Can their philosophy be useful today? Yes, not as a ready-made path, but as a reminder. You can live consciously. You can think independently. You can reject fear and choose freedom. The Cathars were not without sin. They made mistakes, argued, and went to extremes, but they tried. They searched, and for that, they paid the ultimate price. Their only fault was believing in something other than what they were told to believe. Today, we don't have pyres, but we do have algorithms. We have streams of information where it's easy to get lost. There's pressure from all sides, to be like everyone else, to think like everyone else, to feel according to a template. In this world, the Cathar way of thinking sounds like a challenge. And who are you? Are you someone who just repeats, or are you someone who seeks? That's why the memory of the Cathars isn't just history. It's a mirror. You can look into it and see yourself, with your own fears, your own dreams, and questions that no textbook can answer. Everyone who hears the story is already making a choice, to leave it as just a legend, or to accept it as a reminder. And now, to hell with it, let's get back to the question we started with. Were the Cathars heretics or wise men? The Catholic Church considered them heretics. Historians see them as victims, poets as heroes, and philosophers as seekers. But maybe it's simpler than that. The Cathars were people. Strong, honest, vulnerable. They made their choice and stayed true to it. And that means they were real. And if any of their light still lives on in us, then it wasn't for nothing that we remembered this story. Subscribe to the channel if you want stories like this to live on. Give this video a like if this topic touched something inside you, and share it because sometimes memory is all we have left.